Friedrich Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols is a fairly short book, but there's a lot in it. Nietzsche always puts a lot into a short book, even when it is a short book, and some books like Thus Spake Zarathustra are not so short. Well, Twilight of the Idols is something I'm not going to summarize, at least not right now, but I'll give a short introduction to it, and then in the next video I'll comment on one particularly interesting passage in this text. The notion of idols here is what really calls for explanation. Nietzsche is not talking about the worship of wooden images of a god, stone images of a god, gold images of a god. This is, the old school notion of idolatry. Nietzsche is talking about something else. He's talking about an idolatry that afflicts Christian Europe in the 1800s. He's talking about the worship of false gods, but not false gods that come in images of wood or stone or clay or gold. He's talking about the worship of false ideas of God. And he tells us he's going to philosophize with a hammer, and he tells us what that means. You might think that means, well, obviously he's smashing the idols. Well, that would be a sensible enough way to interpret that metaphor, but he tells us that's not the way to interpret the metaphor. What he's doing with his hammer is not smashing them, but tapping on them to see if they ring hollow. The hammer is more like a tuning fork than it is a sledgehammer. Don't picture Nietzsche running through the streets smashing idols with a big hammer. Picture him with a tiny, tiny little hammer, the hammer a doctor uses when he's testing your reflexes or something like that. And he's walking along, and when he finds an idol, instead of smashing it, he just taps on it very gently to see how it sounds. And if it rings hollow, he knows it's just an idol. It's an empty idea of God. Now, what does it mean for an idea of God to be idolatrous? Well, it's an idea of God we created, that we are worshiping instead of God. Now, of course, Nietzsche is taking this in one direction. He's an atheist. He's looking at Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment and Christian ideas of God that are empty ideas of God, and he thinks they need to be critiqued, and we need to get rid of these ideas of God. And the goal here is the atheist goal, to purify European culture of all this corrupt, decadent religion. But there are those who take this in a different way. Let's see, Merold Westphal, a Christian philosopher, and Jean-Luc Marion, another Christian philosopher, and some others, will take Nietzsche's critique of idolatry and treat it as a positive critique. It might be helpful to consider what the Apostle Paul does in the New Testament, in a letter to, I believe, the Colossians. He says that greed is idolatry. He says, among you there must not be any of these things, and he lists some things. One of them is greed, and he says greed is idolatry. No, it's covetousness. Covetousness is idolatry. Well, that means wanting something instead of God, or desiring something instead of God, or loving something with the love due to God, or trusting in something rather than trusting in God. And this is something Paul says we do when we are envious. Well, he's critiquing idolatry in people who no doubt thought that they were cleansed of idolatry. He's talking to Christians who probably thought that they, unlike their pagan neighbors who were worshiping the idols of Zeus and Athena and Apollo, that they were innocent of this sort of idolatry. And Paul says, no, you are also idolaters. You are capable of idolatry. When you covet, you are committing the sin of idolatry, and you must stop it. Paul makes this critique of Christians. And Nietzsche is doing something very similar. He's saying we idolize our concepts of God. And so some Christian philosophers, Westphal and Marion, treat this as a positive critique, a helpful critique. He's exposing false ideas of God, and this is a helpful thing because sometimes we do worship our ideas of God instead of worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, and David, the God who reveals himself in Scripture. That's the God we should be worshiping. And sometimes we worship our ideas of God, but if you examine them, if you tap on them, you might find that they ring hollow. Now, about the nature of these ideas of God, why they ring hollow, how Nietzsche critiques them, well, in very large part, it is Nietzsche's critique of otherworldliness. Otherworldliness is what happens when we desire some other world, some higher world, and we think of it as better than this one. Nietzsche critiques with a sort of psychologist as well as a philosopher's mechanisms the idea of otherworldliness. He critiques our preference for another world, and he says it is rooted in distaste for life. It's rooted in a weakness, a failure to thrive in this world is what inspires us to seek for happiness in a higher world. We dream of heaven because we are not happy on earth, and we should be happy on earth. That's the general idea of the nature of Nietzsche's critique of idolatry. And in the next video, I will talk about one particularly interesting passage about otherworldliness in the Twilight of the Idols.